Hello and welcome to this Foster Care Institute online training webinar, Post-Adoption Depression Syndrome. I am your host, Dr. John DeGarmo, the founder and director of the Foster Care Institute. I also serve as a consultant and an author, trainer for foster, adoptive, and child welfare agencies, and I'm a foster adoptive parent myself. Indeed, through the years, I've had the pleasure of having over 60 children join my family from the foster care system, and I've also had the honor and blessing of adopting 3 children from foster care as well. At the same time, my wife and I have also experienced 4 failed adoptions for a variety of reasons. So we have been able to experience all the blessings and the challenges that go along with adoption. Our goal during this webinar is to better understand what post-adoption depression syndrome is and how to address it. And our key objectives are to increase the awareness of what post-adoption depression is and gain an understanding how to develop and implement strategies designed to best address post-adoption depression syndrome. Now, before we begin to understand or examine what post-adoption depression syndrome is, we need to look at a brief overview of adoption in general. I particularly like this quote from a former foster youth who says this: "I always thought that I was adoptable, even though I was 16 years old. But my caseworker, social worker kept saying I was too old every time I asked him about it. I worked after school at this hardware store, and the guy who owned it was so kind to me. He was such a good guy, and I always talked to him. I never really told him I was in foster care, but one day, when we got to talking, he started to ask me a lot of questions about my family and then about life in foster care. I invited him to my case conference because my social worker said I could invite anyone who I wanted to. And at that point, he asked about adoption. I was shocked at first, but it made sense. We finalized my adoption 3 months ago. That day was the happiest day of my life." Again, this is from a former foster youth. But sometimes we hear that phrase, as that former foster youth indicated, that sometimes children are believed or labeled to be unadoptable. Perhaps they're labeled as a troublemaker. Maybe society labels them as an underachiever. Maybe those who know them indicate they might be uneducated or amount to nothing. Perhaps those who are considered unadoptable are older or might have special needs. And then sadly, and perhaps even tragically, some children are labeled as unlovable. All of these labels also fall under an unadoptable label as well, a label that no child should have placed upon them. For those children who have been labeled as unadoptable, there are indeed obstacles to adopt them, and there are excuses to adopt them as well. Yet I like what Wanda Audette, the Director of Adoption Services, once said: "There are no unadoptable children. There are just unfound homes." It's such a powerful quote. Let's look at it one more time. There are no unadoptable children. There are just unfound homes. Now, as we have seen here at the Foster Care Institute through several of our webinars, today's social workers are truly underpaid, under-resourced, overworked, overwhelmed. Every year, 275,000 children on average enter into the foster care system. That's entering in to the foster care system. We know that the number of children in foster care on any given year currently is between 435,000 to 500,000. It depends upon which statistic you look. It depends upon what month you look at or perhaps what year you look at. But of that 500,000 children who are in foster care, 275,000 enter each year into the system, and all of these children need a home. They need a loving, stable, structured foster care home. Now, some further statistics. Approximately 126,000 children are waiting for adoption each year. 240,000 adults will inquire each year or ask about adoption from foster care, yet only 1 out of 28 will actually adopt. 78% of that 240,000 will inquire, who will never fill out an application or any type of paperwork for adoption. And indeed, only 6% who inquire will finally complete a home study. We hear a lot about permanency, a permanency plan when it comes to foster care. Of the roughly 435,000 to 500,000 children in foster care system, 51% are reunification. They are reunified with their parents. 20% of these children are adoptive. 4% enter into kinship or relative care. 7% are in foster care for long term, and 6% will emancipate themselves. Now, again, before we look at post-adoption depression syndrome, we need to look at some of the barriers that exist in adoption. Many adoptive parents feel they are ignored or put off by the child welfare system. Perhaps adoption does not go through because there's an unpleasant contact with the children before the adoption takes place. Maybe there's some sort of difference in what the adoptive parent is looking for and the child that they encounter that might be up for adoption. Perhaps the potentially adoptive family is frustrated with the agency or the red tape that goes along with policies and practices and procedures, or perhaps they're just frustrated with the system in general. One child who was looking for adoption from the foster care system, let's call him Colin, said once, "I'd like a family that will play sports with me and help me learn about nature and fishing." A child who is waiting for an adoptive family. For those children who are in care and are never adopted, there are risks to remaining in the foster care system. Some of those risks include the level of education is far below the average traditional student. Indeed, as we've seen here at the Foster Care Institute, many children in foster care are on average 18 months behind academically. Other risks in remaining in foster care include lack of self-sufficiency, behavioral adjustment issues, the lack of family and social support system. Those children who remain in foster care system and age out, those girls have a much higher pregnancy rate. And of course, the personal well-being of the child is at risk as well. Adoption, permanency, is a chance for someone to contact in an emergency. When a child is adopted, they have somebody they can call on a rainy night when their tire is flat, somebody that will come and help them. Adoption or permanency is someone to go see or visit during the holiday seasons when they move on and become an adult. Adoption is somebody to walk them down the aisle when they become married. Adoption is a chance for a parent to give a child a better life, to share the gifts that we have been given with another child. For those adoptive parents, adoption is a chance to experience the joy, the fulfillment a child brings into a home and a family. And indeed, as someone who has adopted 3 children, I can fully endorse this. Each child has made me a better person in some way. Adoption is a chance for a parent to parent a child when giving birth is not possible. Adoption is the chance to more likely provide a father figure to a child who's never had such a father figure. To give birth mothers a peace of mind that their children are in a safe place. For those biological family members who have had their child rights terminated through TPR, adoption is an opportunity for those birth parents to again have peace of mind, to find peace and understanding, knowledge that their child is safe. Adoption is a chance to promote the social, economic well being of our nation, to provide a secure and stable education for a child, and quite simply to make the world a better place. A child from Massachusetts once said, "Children need permanent homes with parents who will show them love, and they need this no matter how old they are. It is never too late." Be sure that so many children from the foster care system who have been adopted are success stories, are stories of inspiration. Yet we're here because of post-adoption depression syndrome. So let's dive in. Post-adoption depression is a mood disorder that occurs post-placement or post-adoption or after the adoption of a child. Post means after. Post-adoption depression can be classified as mild, moderate, or severe. Post-adoption depression syndrome, also known as PADS, is a term created by June Bond in 1995. She created post-adoption depression syndrome, the term, to better identify the stress, the anxiety, or even the depression that many adoptive parents experience well after the adoption has been formalized and completed. Now, Karen Foley and John Thompson in the book The Post-Adoption Blues writes this: "The onset of depression can occur days or years after the child joins the family. Prevalence is unknown. Duration is greater than 3 to 12 months. Post-adoption depression can be episodic with remissions and recurrences. More research is needed fully to describe this mood disorder." And again, we give thanks to Karen Foley and John Thompson in their book, The Post-Adoption Blues. Now, it's very likely you have never heard of post-adoption depression syndrome. Indeed, much of society is ignorant of this. Yet it is very, very real for adoptive parents. It is something that is quite normal for adoptive parents to experience. How real is it? How normal is it? Well, look at the statistics. Some statistics state that up to 65% of adoptive mothers experience post-adoption depression syndrome in some fashion. Up to 65% of adoptive mothers, which means more than half, again according to some statistics, more than half of adoptive mothers experience post-adoption depression syndrome. So, if over half of these adoptive mothers are experiencing post-adoption depression syndrome, what might some of those reasons be? Why might a parent, an adoptive parent, experience post-adoption depression syndrome? Well, there's a number of reasons. To begin with, for some, post-adoption depression syndrome stems from a lack of sleep deprivation, if you will. There are those adoptive parents who may feel overwhelmed with all the responsibilities, overwhelmed by the knowledge that the adoption is finally completed, overwhelmed by the amount of caring for the child once the adoption is finalized. For some adoptive parents, they might feel like feelings of guilt. Guilt because the bonding, the attachment they expected to suddenly happen, quite simply does not happen. Does not happen as soon as they may wish, or sadly, that bonding with the child and the adoptive parent never happens at all. And again, when this occurs, when that bonding that they expected to happen immediately does not happen as soon as they wish, or not at all, that adoptive parent experiences feelings of guilt. Guilt that leads to post adoption depression syndrome. Other reasons? Well, many times an adoptive family does not have any type of support or support system after the adoption. For example, perhaps a foster parent is attending a foster parent support system, but after the adoption is finalized, they no longer are under a foster care child welfare umbrella. They're no longer licensed as foster parents. They give up that licensing, so to speak, and as a result, they do not have that support system in place. For some adoptive parents, they feel guilty or they feel sad for the child's birth parents. Perhaps they feel guilty for adopting the child from the birth parent. For some, they might experience post adoption depression syndrome due to the isolation. Isolation due to the feelings that no one understands that adoption is different than having a biological family. They do not feel that anybody at all understands or appreciates that their family dynamic is different. Now, as we indicated earlier, post adoption depression syndrome is normal. Adoptive parents need to recognize and understand that this is normal and in some ways it is predictable. Predictable. Adoptive parents need to recognize that when they adopt a child, it is very likely that they might experience some sort of post adoption depression syndrome. Again, because it is normal. When some studies indicate that up to 65% of adoptive mothers experience it, this indicates quite strongly that it's predictable. Post adoption depression syndrome is in no way an indication that the adoptive parent is a failure as a parent or as a failure in parenting style, in their parenting fashion, in any way whatsoever. When an adoptive parent experiences post adoption depression syndrome, it is no indication at all that they are a failure as a parent or they're not good, so to speak, in parenting styles. So, what does post adoption depression syndrome look like? What might the signs be? How can you recognize if you are suffering from post adoption depression syndrome or somebody that you know is suffering from post adoption depression syndrome? Because as we've seen, it is quite normal. Well, some of those signs might be a difficulty, a challenge, if you will, in making day to day decisions, or even difficulty in concentrating. Those who experience post adoption depression syndrome often have a very hard time sleeping. They find great difficulty in falling asleep, or they have a need for additional or more sleep throughout the day. One sign of post adoption depression syndrome is a lack of energy or a loss of energy, feelings of extreme fatigue, or always feeling exhausted. Other signs of post adoption depression syndrome is a feeling of powerlessness, that they have no power at all in regards to decision making or day to day activities. They feel powerless. They feel worthless. Those adoptive parents who are experiencing post-adoption depression syndrome, they may feel a sense of worthlessness. Indeed, we saw earlier that some of the reasons of post-adoption depression syndrome is a feeling of guilt. Perhaps guilt because of lack of bonding or attachment as soon as they wished, or maybe guilt from adopting the child from the biological family members. Well, some of those signs might be an overwhelming sense of guilt. Other signs of post adoption depression syndrome include feelings of irritability, always feeling irritable, or loss of interest and enjoyment in activities that once enjoyed, hobbies and interests that one enjoyed doing day in and day out, hobbies and interests and activities that they love doing no longer have an interest or find any sense of enjoyment in that. Indeed, many who experience post-adoption depression syndrome have a feeling of hopelessness. They simply feel hopeless. Other signs include being anxious, anxiousness over being a good enough parent. Because as we saw earlier, some adoptive parents who experience post-adoption depression syndrome have guilt because they feel they're not good enough as a parent. Well, there is that anxiousness of being a good enough parent. Some adoptive parents experience suicidal thoughts. And I might add here that at any time an adoptive parent experiences feelings of suicide, thoughts of suicide, professional therapy is a must immediately. Other signs include becoming easily frustrated with yourself or maybe the child, feeling frustrated easily towards others. As you can imagine, another sign of post-adoption depression syndrome includes feelings of depression or a depressed mood and ongoing sadness, overwhelming feelings of sadness. And finally, a sign of post-adoption depression syndrome in an adoptive parent might be weight gain or a change of diet. Now, we have seen the signs and the reasons for post-adoption depression syndrome. So, how do we address post-adoption depression syndrome for that adoptive parent who is feeling insecure, feeling hopeless, feeling helpless, feeling sense of anxiety or guilt? How do we address it? Well, to begin with, those who experience post-adoption depression syndrome need to make sure they're taking care of themselves. They need to make sure that they are instituting some sort of self-care. And what that self-care looks like, quite simply, is taking care of themselves, making sure and ensuring that their own diet is healthy. A healthy diet goes a long ways towards the mental health of an individual, the well-being, if you will. Other forms of self-care are getting exercise. Those adoptive parents who are experiencing post-adoption depression syndrome, exercise is one way to address it. And we saw earlier a lack of sleep. Well, getting enough sleep, enough rest is one way to address post-adoption depression syndrome. But going further though, let's look into it deeper. As we saw earlier, some adoptive parents experience post-adoption depression syndrome because they feel guilty that that bonding, that attachment did not happen as soon as they expected or as soon as they wished. Well, the truth is quite simple. It takes time for the bond to happen. It takes time for that attachment to happen between the adoptive child and the adoptive parent. This bonding and attachment does not happen immediately. Once adoption occurs, it's not a happy ending after ever right away. What many adoptive parents do not recognize is It takes time for this bonding and attachment between the adoptive parent and the child to occur. This is not something that happens overnight or suddenly. It can be a very, very slow process. It can take many months. It might take years for the bond and the attachment to develop and to grow into a healthy fashion between adoptive parent and adoptive child. So, adoptive parents need to recognize they need to allow this bonding, this attachment, to happen over a period of time and to remain patient, not to rush it, but again, to remain patient. We saw earlier that many adoptive parents feel they have no sense of support group or support system. Well, one way to address post adoption depression syndrome within an adoptive parent is to find that sense of support group. A support group of adoptive parents. Or if there is no adoptive parent support group in the area, to join or maybe rejoin a foster parent support group. Another way to address post adoption depression syndrome is to give plenty of affection towards the child. The adoptive parent giving love and hugs and affection, positive, healthy affection, and great deals of it towards the child and to the child. This helps with the bonding, this helps with the attachment. Another way to address post adoption depression syndrome is to respond to the child's needs. The adoptive parent needs to be the parent and respond to what the child needs, what the child wants. Another way to address post adoption depression syndrome is for that adoptive parent, as we noted earlier, to build a support network. A support network of friends or family members, or maybe members of a faith based organization, those who can give them some type of support during those difficult times. As we've talked about here a few times, adoptive parents feel that the attachment and bonding should happen quickly. We know that does not always happen. So, therefore, the adoptive parent needs to manage their expectations, to recognize that this bonding attachment is not going to happen right away, that they're not going to be a perfect parent. Instead, they need to be more of a realistic parent. Now, not only does a adoptive parent suffer from post-adoption depression syndrome, but the children can suffer from it as well. So the adoptive parent needs to be prepared for their adopted child to suffer from feelings of post-adoption depression syndrome as well. To be sure, adoptive parents who are experiencing PADS, post-adoption depression syndrome, they should see a professional therapist or counselor if they're unable to find the help that they need themselves, or to talk to a caseworker. I often tell foster parents that when my car breaks down, I am not a mechanic. I will call up a mechanic. When my air conditioning breaks down, I'm going to call the AC guy because, again, I'm not an expert in that. When I have a toothache, I'm calling upon the dentist because I'm not an expert in that either. Which quite simply means we as parents are not the experts in every single fashion. So if you call up to see a professional therapist or counselor yourself, it does not mean any indication that you are a failure as a parent, that you are a failure as a person. Instead, it means the opposite. It means when you reach out to that professional therapist or counselor for help for yourself or for the child, you are taking positive steps. You are making an initiative to get the help that you can't provide yourself. Finally, one way to address post-adoption depression syndrome is perhaps through medication. Now, we live in a society and we live in a world that seems to be more and more overly medicated. So it is important and is indeed essential and necessary, and I shall even use the word imperative, that if you are considering medication for your post-adoption depression syndrome, that you first Talk to your doctor about it. You should never seek out medication yourself without being prescribed by the doctor or recommended by the doctor. So seek out a doctor. Talk to the doctor about your post-adoption depression syndrome and ask them if there's some type of medication that they might recommend or prescribe, and only take the medicine that they do prescribe. There are so many children in the foster care system that are looking for an adoptive family. There are so many children in the foster care system who never get that adoptive family. If you are blessed and fortunate enough to adopt a child from the foster care system or adopt a child in any fashion, recognize this. Once the adoption is finalized and occurs, it does not mean the happy ending that you hoped for. Many times, the adoptive parent can sink into post-adoption depression syndrome for all the reasons we've covered here, and as we've noted here, it can be normal and predicted. So, if you have adopted or you're expecting to adopt, recognize this. You very well could suffer from post-adoption depression syndrome. And this is important to recognize. In no way does this mean you are a failure as an adoptive parent. In no way does it mean the adoption was a failure either. For much more, visit the website, the Foster Care Institute, at drjohndegarmofostercare.com. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter, Dr. John DeGarmo. Email me at drjohndegarmo@gmail.com if you have questions about this webinar or other webinars. If you are a person of faith, I would encourage you to pick up the book Faith and Foster Care, How We Impact God's Kingdom, because we talk about adoption in there. And again, if you're a person of faith, this might be a resource, a valuable resource for you. And indeed, we have several books at the Foster Care Institute, and there's certainly one there for you as well. As I noted, my family has had the blessing and the joy of adopting 3 children from the foster care system. We've also experienced 4 failed adoptions. 4 failed adoptions that spiraled my wife and I into worlds of grief and heartbreak. My friend, these are normal. Take care of yourself. Recognize the signs. Get the help that you need if you suspect that you are experiencing post-adoption depression syndrome yourself. For the Foster Care Institute, I'm Dr. John DeGarmo. Thank you so much for taking part in this webinar, and thank you for making a difference in our world by caring for children in crisis.